you, Mr. Chairman. Um, I'm trying to puzzle out why it's been difficult to sustain an interagency collaboration on this. There has, there's a bad reason this could happen, which is that bureaucracies under financial stress will often try to get rid of programs, shared programs that they don't view as along their core line of business, and it's a natural thing. I think the only solution to that is to have the Congress say, "Hey, this is something important that's slipping through the cracks between our agencies," and basically knock heads to make sure that those are maintained. There's another potential technical reason. Are there real differences in the types of radiation exposures that are of interest to different agencies? If you're worried about health care, it's probably different than if you're worried about space-based exposure versus ingestion of radioisotopes from nuclear accidents and so on. And so how much of that difficulty has to do with when you sit down to write the specifications of what you want to learn, that you find different agencies have different specifications? Does anyone want to?
Yeah, you're exactly right, and in that different agencies do have different needs, but a lot of times they overlap. So for instance, while NASA is going to care about space radiation and DOE is going to care about Earth-based types of radiation, you actually almost always need to use the Earth-based radiation as a control to understand space radiation. So they should actually be cooperating. They did for years. You asked the question why they stopped, and I have absolutely no clue. Probably you're right. Having somebody from DOE at the table would have been useful.
Yeah. Any other comments on sort of the technical differences between the types of exposures?
Well, I think just talking to the range of agencies that we met with, they all agreed that there were some common areas of research that would be of use to each of the agencies. So that's why they would sometimes jointly fund some of these ongoing studies, like the million-person studies and other studies, where they can get research that would be useful to their particular settings.
I agree with Gail that there's a fair amount of overlap too, which makes it a little bit puzzling, but certainly there's obvious distinctions, NASA being very interested in cosmic radiation and so forth, but otherwise there's a fair amount of overlap in just how we address these.
Okay. Now, the other sort of big question here is, let's say that you're able to go to a less conservative, zero intercept model for what you thought the human danger was. Is there anyone who's done, an exhaustive and high-quality study of what the health and economic impact of that would be? Just assume that we declare a higher level of, a de minimis exposure to be actually safe. What would be the economic impact? What would be the indirect health impact in terms of more allowable chest X-rays, more, a shift in our energy mix, presumably towards nuclear, and so on?
It's an interesting question. I'm not aware of any such analyses, but certainly as practicing physicians, most practicing physicians are still very much recognizing that the benefits typically outweigh the risks. And so I don't know that there's been a huge reduction in the use of medical imaging, for example, because of whether there's the linear no threshold intercepting the origin of the axis, or whether they're considering there's a threshold effect or even a hormetic effect. Most physicians are still focusing on the benefits and practicing appropriately.
But there's still some limit. I mean, they reach a point at which, you've already had, 5 X-rays this month, and maybe we shouldn't have another one. And what is there a sound scientific basis for that kind of decision?
In my opinion, no, there's not. And when I'm faced with patients who are worried about those kind of thresholds, I'm going right back to the benefits and saying, what is the reason why your physician needs these studies? Because the benefits are clear-cut. The risks are very much uncertain, and typically, in almost all cases, when there's a real sound medical reason to do the study, we're going to favor doing the study over a theoretical risk.
But it's your suspicion that, to the extent that doctors are limiting, things like X-ray or PET scans or so on, that it's probably the conservatism, in related to radiation doses probably nets out harmful for patients?
Well, we certainly will favor imaging tests that don't use ionizing radiation when we can. So, for example, MRI or ultrasound don't have the same risks, and we certainly, and when we do need to use ionizing radiation, we're promoting using as low as reasonably achievable doses. But in terms of an economic threshold or economic benefit to a threshold, I'm just not familiar with any of those studies.
Yeah, but where I would say where the economic threshold would probably come in, and I don't actually know the numbers, would be in how far do we have to clean up our nuclear waste sites. It's probably a difference of trillions, at least billions of dollars, if we accept the linear non-threshold or if we have a lower threshold for cleanup. That's where I would think that there'd be a big savings in money.
Yeah, I know. I recall a paper by Richard Wilson of Harvard Physics Department, who you may know is, who was actually, I believe, one of the first Westerners allowed at Chernobyl and a real expert on this. He calculated the optimal radius of evacuation from Fukushima. Because you can mess up either way. If you know, there are two effects, obviously. People suffer from exposure to radiation if they're too close. On the other hand, there's a well-documented probability of having people die, particularly the elderly, if you move them. Just relocate them. And so this allows you to calculate an optimal radius of evacuation. It was the conclusion of his paper, at least, that actually the Japanese evacuated too large a radius. And ultimately had a negative health effect from that decision. And so this is just another example where getting the science right here is so important. And now I'm over time myself, and so happy to hold back.